My name's Robbie Buckett. I am professor of history and director of the Margaret Walker Center at Jackson State University. Today is November the 8th, 2021. It is approximately 10:02 a.m. Central Time. I'm here with Bert Davis. Bert, would you do me the favor of stating and spelling your name for us for the record?
Okay, so good morning. For the record, my name is Dr. Robert. Everyone calls me Bert Davis, so that's Dr. period, R-O-B-E-R-T, parenthesis B-E-R-T, parenthesis D-A-V-I-S.
And do I have your permission to record this interview?
Absolutely.
Thanks. Glad to have you here. Let's begin with some background information. Tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, how you grew up, a little bit about your family, your education, those sorts of things.
Okay, well, my background is in animal and poultry science and veterinary medicine. So people are continuously asking me where I am now, which in the background you can see America's Black Holocaust Museum. I have spent the better part of 30 years in the zoo and aquarium industry, starting off as a research veterinarian at the Smithsonian, and then traveled to DC, down to Zoo Atlanta, up to Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago, over to the Milwaukee Zoo, the Zoological Society of Milwaukee, then the National Mississippi River Museum and Aquarium and Historical Society in Iowa, and then back here in Milwaukee to run America's Black Holocaust Museum. I grew up in Chicago, one of two kids, grew up pretty middle class. Both of my parents are from Alabama. My mother she retired as a surgical nurse, and my dad a retired high school educator. Both my sister and I went to Tuskegee. And so my sister's an architect. And as I said, I was an animal and poultry science major with a minor in biology. Then stayed on at Tuskegee to go to graduate school and veterinary school, and then stayed almost 2 years helping finish up my graduate research and then teaching, and then went on to the Smithsonian as a research fellow. Growing up in Chicago, South Side, predominantly an African-American and slightly Jewish neighborhood called South Shore in Chicago. And my parents were pretty strict. They demanded that my sister and I take education very seriously. And they created a cadence around studying and reading, which in most part has kind of contributed to our success over the varying years. So we had to read these books before we even could do our homework. So I don't think you're old enough to remember anything about the Hardy Boys or the Nancy Drew Mysteries or the Happy Hollisters, but we had to read all that stuff before we could even do our homework. And so that created a discipline which actually helped us out in the long run, because invariably when I was in third grade, I was reading at the 10th grade level. And when my sister was in fourth grade, she was reading at the 10th grade level. And so that afforded us the ability to really appreciate reading and become pretty voracious readers over this long period of our lifetimes. There was a strict family ethic around certain things that were traditional. And I am by far a believer in traditions, especially as it relates to cultural traditions. I've often said in the last 15 or 20 years that culture trumps strategy every day, and that the cultural practices that we've been inculcated with growing up eventually helps to determine who we are as adults. And so we always had to have dinner together, and we always had to clean up the house on Saturday mornings before we can go out and play. And these kind of rituals kind of stuck with us and helped to form this family unit. We had a ritual, even though we never went to Disney World or Disneyland at the time. We would visit our relatives in the South every summer. So we, to this very day, some of my favorite people are some of my first cousins. that live in New Orleans, they live in Alabama, they live in Atlanta. Some of them even live in Texas. So those were the kind of things that I grew up with that have stayed with me through the years and helped to create that family structure and that kind of cultural competency for how we had to keep these traditions. Because as I said before, culture trumps strategy every day.
How did you end up going to Tuskegee with your sister? Or, I mean, what was that?
So she came 3 years behind me. So it was 1976, Thanksgiving dinner. It was snowing like you wouldn't believe in Chicago. And at some point during the Thanksgiving dinner, I announced to my family that I was going to Tuskegee. No, my father was a Tuskegee grad. And at that time, I didn't know I was a third generation Tuskegee. And I just thought I was going to be second generation. So I announced at the table that I was going to Tuskegee and that I was going to study veterinary medicine, of which my sister replied, "We don't even have any pets. What is this with you wanting to go to veterinary school?" But I always was deeply interested in biology, very, very deeply interested in animals. And when I was really young, when people say, "What do you think you want to be?" I knew what a biologist was, but I knew I wanted to study animals, and I knew that the suffix after the suffix around the study is ology. So I said, I want to be an animalologist. And they were like, "I don't think that word exists." So I had to learn that it wasn't an animalologist. I wanted to be a zoologist. And I didn't even become a zoologist. I actually went right from getting an animal science and biology minor to go into graduate school and then go into Tuskegee. I also selected Tuskegee because it's the only HBCU in the United States that confers the veterinary degree. And so back then I realized that I was kind of tongue-in-cheek killing two birds with one stone by going to my dad's alma mater and then going to an HBCU and then going to Tuskegee that confers that degree. So that's why I landed up down in Tuskegee, Alabama, 1978.
So you're a vet student at Tuskegee, and you finish up. At some point, you mentioned that you got a fellowship at the Smithsonian. What was that? Was that directly out of graduate school? How did that work?
So it worked. So after veterinary, so I finished veterinary school in 1989. So I started in 85, finished in 89. And my professor, and I had a job offer in Chicago. And it was a small veterinary practice right outside the suburbs of Chicago. And the vet there didn't do any exotics, and exotics during that time were becoming really, really popular. People were getting birds and reptiles. Potbelly pigs were really popular back then. And he said, "I don't know anything about it, so you can work for me, and then you can handle all the exotics. And at some point, if this relationship works out, I have a couple of clinics. We could eventually, maybe you could even practice in my clinic and you can buy it." So I had that one option, but then one of my major professors was like, "You've done so much work towards getting your master's. You've done all your classwork. Why don't you at least finish up your research? And then you could do your thesis whenever you have time, but you're already here. You've only got like a summer's worth of research to do." So I said, at the time I was dating a woman who went to medical school at the University of Wisconsin. So if I stayed in Chicago, I would have been close to her. She kind of helped me when I was in veterinary school. So it was a hard deliberation there for a minute. But I knew she was going to be wrapped up as a first year med student, studying all the time. And the opportunity to come back and teach. So I also taught while I was finishing up my graduate research. I said, what the heck? So I did. So that was the first year. And then in the second year, I just need to finish up a couple of experiments, which really wasn't a year's worth of work. but they offered me to teach some senior level research classes called Senior Seminar, along with also teaching biology and finishing up some lab work. So I did that, and so it must have been the fall of, oh, I can't remember now. If it was spring of 91, I guess it was the spring of 91. Oh, no, the fall of 90, spring of 91, one of my professors met with some people that at a conference in North Carolina. And one of them was a woman by the name of Bobby Rubinoff, who was the director of fellowships and grants for the entire Smithsonian. And he says, hey, I've got this really, young guy who loves animals and loves research and would love the opportunity to work in a zoo. And so I submitted a proposal in there around some of the research I was doing, and got lucky to then join the Department of Animal Health at the National Zoo as a research fellow. And my initial work was really, really cool, actually. It was under the study of something called theriogenology, which is really the study of reproduction and in animals. And what we were doing was we were doing artificial insemination, in vitro fertilization, and endangered species that had been perfected in human labs. And so during that time in the early 90s, in the late 80s, well, all through the 80s and the early 90s, these research facilities were getting slammed for using these research animals, as test kits. And this was a true example of where we could actually take the benefits of what was done in human research and apply it to endangered species. So our first programs were around doing IVF and artificial insemination in big cats. So I was part of a team that was led by Joe Gale Howard, who has passed now. And we did field work in many zoos and aquariums around the country. And they, along with David Wilk, did international field studies on AI and IVF. And so I was the sperm guy. So I would help collect the sperm from the males that were under anesthesia, of course, and process the sperm and then freeze it in liquid nitrogen. And this was the first creation of what we now have with several zoos around the country called the frozen zoo. And so we were part of some landmark research in creating the first IVF tiger, first IVF clouded leopard, first AI Florida panther, cheetah, snow leopard. And so they were the research was primarily around big cats. And as you could imagine, back then I went for some very interesting dinner conversation when people would say, what do you do at the zoo? And I'd say, blah, 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 and I collect the sperm. What? So so that was from 91 to 93. And then I actually then joined the staff as a supervisory veterinary medical officer at the Department of Animal Health, and was actually the clinic manager for the Department of Animal Health. I was there until 97. So my original proposal was for 18 months, and I ended up staying almost 7 years. Was really inspired by doing a lot of outreach. I realized that there were a lot of children of color who didn't know anything about professions in the in zoos and aquariums, whether it was animal keeping or research, you name it, they really had no idea. And they really didn't have any direct contact with animals that are in their neighborhoods and communities other than the typical urban squirrels and birds and so forth. So we created some programming that actually got some national recognition that was called Scientists in the Classroom. And one of my, still to this day, as a matter of fact, today is her birthday, Louisa Sheldon created this program where, along with Jeff Goldstein, Dr. Jeff Goldstein, who at the time was at Air and Space, we actually started writing grants to go into different rural communities around the country and even Hawaii and talk about opportunities at the Smithsonian, and then just talk about opportunities in being a scientist. And we visited schools all over the Metro DC area and in several different states around the country. It was really rewarding. One of the things that I noticed that was a constant for me was going into classrooms in some of these urban cities, and the teachers would be amazed because I would play these games in the beginning where I would just put up a picture of an animal and I'd say, name this animal. And it became a little bit of a competition. And the person who actually named the most animals, I actually had some stuffed animals that I then gave to them as prizes. So it really, really got it competitive. But one of the things that stuck with me, and I realized that this could be a tool for getting kids interested in careers in zoos and aquariums, was several of the teachers all the time would say, you know, little Jimmy over there doesn't talk to anybody. And he usually has an attitude, and I can't get him to participate. But his face lit up when he saw these animals, and he knew all these animals. And the teachers were like mesmerized. They were like, they didn't know that they could tap into their kids through this particular resource because it was extracurricular, right? It wasn't anything that they were teaching. And so that eventually helped us better understand how education in informal science settings could really augment the curriculum that's being taught in some of these schools. So, for example, we created partnerships with school systems and individual schools where if the teachers were teaching about rainforest animals, we would then, after the curriculum, after that section, we'd host them at the National Zoo's rainforest exhibit, which is called Amazonian. So they got a chance to learn about rainforest animals, and then they actually came to a rainforest exhibit. And so it was a really powerful experience. So I then started leaning heavily towards education. So in '97, I took a position as a director of education and external affairs for Zoo Atlanta. So I got out of veterinary medicine. Of course, people who I went to vet school with and other vets around the country thought I was crazy. They were like, first of all, why would you want to be an educator? And second, I was like, well, I'm going to direct the programs, but yeah, I like being in the classroom. And secondly, at that point, I was one of only 2 Black veterinarians that worked in any zoo in the entire United States. And he also was a Tuskegee graduate. And so my mentor was like, when I told her I was thinking about getting out of veterinary medicine, she was like, you're not doing it. And coincidentally, she ended up hiring me at Zoo Atlanta to run the education department and work under conservation. So it always amazes me how you never say never and you never say always. And so she was one of my true mentors all through the end of undergrad and all through vet school. That's Dr. Rita McManaman, who's actually a professor at University of Georgia's vet school now. So, and then that's where I kind of went on the administrative path. So I stayed at Zoo Atlanta from '97 to 2001. Then came back home to Chicago to be the vice president of education and government affairs at Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago, and was there from 2001 to 2005. 2005, I left to go up to Milwaukee to be the president and CEO of the Zoological Society of Milwaukee. And so not unlike many other zoos and aquariums around the country, the zoos and aquariums have a public part, which is normally financed through some municipality, whether it's the city or the county, or maybe even the state or region. And then they always have a private side. And so I ran the not-for-profit which was fundraising, but it was also education, conservation, marketing, PR, membership. So we really kind of split the zoo down the middle. And it was a great experience. I was there from '05 to 2016. Started doing some consulting back in Chicago, and then I was called to Iowa to run the National Mississippi River Museum, AAAM, and Historical Society. And that wasn't a really great experience for me. I only lasted a little over a year there. Went back to consulting, and then had this kind of a seismic change in terms of my career, but my beliefs were always in the strength and value of museums. So I've been on the AAAM board. I roll off in 2022, but I've been on that board now. I can't even remember how many years. It's been over 10, it's been at least 10 years. And I'm on the AAAM board with you. And so the value of museums was always front of mind with me. And for a long time, people in zoos and aquariums didn't think that they were museums, and I had to convince them they are living museums. And people on the museum side, well, botanical gardens and zoos and aquariums, you guys are over there. No, we're not. We're all under the same canopy. So this summer of 2019, I was in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and I got a call from two of my good friends who said, you're coming back to Milwaukee. And I said, yeah, I'll be up there next month. We're going to play golf, smoke cigars, drink bourbon. And they were like, no, there's going to be a position opening, and we really think it's perfect for you. And so then I got the email in about 30 minutes, and I realized that I was. And that was to reopen or reemerge America's Black Holocaust Museum. And so the history of the museum is truly a distinction because it was founded by Dr. James Cameron. And Dr. James Cameron is one of the only known survivors of a public lynching in the United States history. He was living in Marion, Indiana, and in 1930, when he was 16, two of his adult friends asked him to go for a joyride. And he said, sure. And they were driving, and they let him drive. And they pulled up on a couple, and they tried to rob him. And they called him Jimmy. They gave little Jimmy Cameron the gun and said, you should shoot him. And he said, what? I know these people. I know their family. They know my family. And so he said, no. So he threw the gun down and he ran. There was a scuffle and people got shot and died. Well, as the story goes, as you're familiar with, they were arrested that night. He was arrested with them as well. An angry, drunken mob broke into the jail, subdued the sheriff, and hung the two adults. He had the noose around his neck, and they literally were marching him up to the tree when this white woman said, that's little Jimmy Cameron. I can't believe he had anything to do with this. And other white people in the crowd were like, yeah, we know his family. So literally the deputy took the noose off and said, run. And that's where he came within an inch of losing his life. So of course, that profoundly affected him. He had to do some jail time, but nothing significant. But of course, the moral of the story is he lived. And he's the only person to survive a lynching that actually wrote a book about it called A Time of Terror. And then the only person to then create the museum. He was a self-taught historian, became an ED, and it became his life work. So in the 70s, 80s, he was collecting all this materials, and he's done a bunch of writings. And as you can imagine, his wife was like, okay, we don't have any room in the basement. We don't have any room in the garage. You got to do something about this. So in 1988, he rented a boxing gym from the city of Milwaukee for $1. He leased it and opened the America's Black Holocaust Museum in 1988. And he ran the museum basically by himself with a bunch of a little staff, but a bunch of volunteers until he passed in 2006. And because he wasn't there, and two of his major benefactors also passed. Well, one of his major benefactors also passed, who, by the way, was Jewish. So in 2008, with the loss of Dr. Cameron and then the recession, the museum had to close. And so there was the creation of a virtual museum in 2010 that launched in 2011. That is not, I wouldn't characterize it because it's not a website. It's really a virtual classroom. And it's richly embedded with over 3,300 pages of content. People have used it in other countries to create curriculum. I mean, it really is a robust virtual museum. And then in the probably around 2015, 2016, there were this slow movement to try to recreate the museum. And then in 2017, 2018, there was a large infusion of some cash that was donated as part of a challenge grant. So the county executive at the time, Chris Abley, did a $100,000 challenge grant to the community, and over $460,000 was raised because of that challenge grant. And then subsequently, there were other significant grants that started coming in. The interesting part about the building itself is it sits, and it's all new construction where we are, but it sits on a block that is a campus where these two African-American women, Malele Cox, who was the alderwoman of that board, and then a woman by the name of Melissa Allen, who was a developer. And there was an old school, the Garfield School, that was built in the late 1800s. Then there's an addition to the immediately to the south that was added in the 70s, probably. And then the new construction is on the north side of the old school, which is a mixed-use apartments on all the floors above the first floor. And the museum itself, which has about 10,000 square feet, is on first floor. And they literally were pretty resolute in saying, we're not going to let some commercial entity come in here. This space is always going to be kept for the museum. And so then my predecessor, Brad Pruitt, worked diligently to start trying to rebuild the museum. So the museum is 100% brand new construction. And the museum exhibit space itself is about 5,000 square feet. Very modest in terms of size, but we've already got some initial plans on how we can expand and where we can expand in the community. The other significant thing about where it is it's located in a part of Milwaukee called Bronzeville. And many urban cities, from the 40s and 50s and 60s had Bronzevilles that were very, very, very successful. One of the most exceptional ones, of course, was Black Wall Street in Tulsa. And the reason that they were successful is obvious. I mean, during those times, we couldn't integrate. We couldn't go anywhere else. So we had our own everything. So money exchanged hands in these communities 6, 7, 8, 9, 20 times. So those communities flourished. And so the museum is serving as an anchor and on the cultural development side to reaffirm and reestablish Milwaukee's Bronzeville. So several Fortune 500 companies have moved into the Bronzeville area. And so this reemergence of the museum is going to be important in continuing to serve as this anchor. And so it's really working out to be a win-win situation so far.
This is a pretty dramatic shift for you professionally, though. Did you have any doubts when you took this on and decided to make this change in your career?
I didn't have any doubts because I knew that I had to kind of treat this, Bobby, as like a startup. And so I've been pretty successful on the fundraising arm. And so though I knew that I wouldn't be the curator, right, my job was to hire the curator. Right now, I've been an educator, so I could help with that, but my job is to hire someone. So I was never nervous about what I could do because it became purposeful. And so many of my friends so I started in September 2019. Unfortunately, COVID hit because we wanted to reopen the museum during the DNC was going to be in Milwaukee the summer of 2020. Of course, that all was obliterated. But it's given us more time to prepare. But what I did find is this work is hard, right? So I typically say, and I said this to my cousin last night, for over 30 years, my life was lions and tigers and bears, oh my. Now it's people being lynched and killed, enslaved, disenfranchised, our culture is being obliterated. We've got some firsts and we've done some tremendous things, which continues to show and demonstrate the resiliency of Africans in America. But the stories are really profound and very, very challenging. And so that's been the kind of paradigm shift. I mean, when I was working in zoos and stuff, the concern was, well, I can't see the elephant. Well, it's like 105 degrees. The elephants are inside, right? Go inside to see the elephant. Or my hot dog is cold. Or the cotton candy machines. Those were my big worries, right? If somebody had to complain about the experience. Now it's like, how do we couch this information, which most of it is misinformation, deleted or diminished information, just blatantly lying, incorrect information? How do we bring this information to light? So as you know, one of the hardest things to ever equip yourself with and get to is the truth. And so the creation and being involved, although the exhibits were already established by the time I got here in 19, but helping to create the culture of this experiential learning journey that we want to take people throughout the museum is one that we want people we want to invoke a sense of all these experiences, all of these emotions that come with our history, our shared history, so it's just not ours, it's America's history. And so we start out, some of the exhibits start out with just world history and Africa being the cradle of civilization. And then it moves into the Middle Passage and the transatlantic slave trade. And then it talks about the economics of slavery, which most people don't get. That there was slavery was one of the most brutal forms of genocide, even though the ultimate goal was not to kill anybody, but the treatment of human beings, probably one of the most despicable ever, over a 400-year period of time. But also that there are some challenges that we've overcome, that politically, through civil rights, through sports and entertainment, through education, through science and technology, you name it, that there's a resiliency to Africans in America, which we should celebrate, but there's still lots of history that needs to be told. One of the significant things about this shift in, the subject matter is it really hits home for me because both of my parents are from the Deep South. And the stories that my dad had shared over the years about when we would go on these family vacations, when I told you before, visiting our relatives, he had a gun and sometimes he had two, right? Because it was a rare occasion that we would fly, we would always drive so we could just go to all these little small towns. So there are thousands upon thousands of those stories that are impactful. So, for example, we're technically closed, but we will do tours for some potential donors and partners. And just this past Thursday, we had a very prominent CEO come through the exhibit, and she cried in various parts of the museum 4 times, once totally uncontrollably, because of where she and her family were tried to be made aware. Her parents wanted she and her sister to be made aware of all these things about American history that also involve these things, past, present, and even future. It still hit her in a way that she just couldn't consume it. And so, this is really hard stuff, and I know you know this. And so we strategically have boxes of Kleenex all around the museum, because we know where people kind of like got to take a break, right? So we've got a reflection room where you can just sit down. And so that's the biggest shift. I never was nervous about it because I'm very familiar with Milwaukee. Now, if I had to make this journey somewhere else and didn't know anybody, didn't know any donors, didn't know any people, didn't have any friends, yeah, then my nerves would have really been different. But I was just literally coming back home. As a matter of fact, the first week I was there, I saw the mayor, and the mayor said, "Well, doctor, I would say welcome back, but I'm going to say welcome back home." So that made it a lot easier and made the transition a lot smoother.
That was a great answer, and kind of prefigured one of my questions that I want to follow up on a little bit. As the president and CEO of a museum, it's your job to make sure that the museum is able to function fiscally and operate on a day-to-day basis, and to hire the people to do the work, as you mentioned. But you're also dealing with an incredibly deep, difficult subject that is not often what people consider to be a sales pitch to folks when you're fundraising. So my question is, what is your philosophy for how you balance those two things, right? Like, how do you balance the complicated, deep, controversial in the sense of people who don't know this history, who are being exposed to it for the first time, they're shocked, right? How do you balance that with what your day-to-day role is as the president and CEO, and what's your philosophy there?
So I'm just going to step away just 1 second. I'm going to get some water because I see you having water and I need to drink some water. So just give me a second. So that's a great question. And I'm going to be humble and transparent and say, I don't know if we worked that out yet. And here's why. So on the operational side, number one, I've got a small staff, it's a small museum, small budget. So when I left the zoo, my budget was almost 12 million, had over 500 volunteers, had a staff of almost 70, 20 interns a year, you name it, right? So the scale has changed. The importance has not changed. And so the way in which we still operate is going to have to be fiscally sound anyway. The weaving of the content has been, of course, the biggest change for me, as I alluded to before, in terms of coming from the animal side to now this very complicated and complex side of educating people around the plight of Americans on Africa, especially through the lens of African Americans as well. But here's something that has happened that I know you're aware of, which is kind of, and so I'm going to couch this, and I don't mean to be facetious, but there's an adage: you never let a good crisis go to waste. Well, unfortunately, because of the trial that's going on right now in Georgia, right? Killing of Breonna Taylor, everybody internationally seeing what happened to George Floyd. it rocked this country and the world to its core. And so on the one side, I started getting calls from organizations that typically we would have to jump through 10 hoops and write a plethora of doggone proposals to get $10,000. They were writing us checks for $25,000 and $50,000 without asking for a proposal. They were like, this work that you're doing is hard. We don't necessarily understand it. You know, we want to appear as if we are supporting you. And, you know, for the most part, people have been pretty honest with us about them really wanting to support our work. And now the subtext to that is they will easily admit, we don't really know what your work is, right? So then that's where it's our job to say, well, this is our work, right? And it's not to beat you over the head, right? So this whole thing about critical race theory and deleting and diminishing education and not wanting our kids to feel bad and about themselves, this whole thing has been blown out of context, but it's been blown out of context for a reason. And that is what has happened to this country from colonialism to slavery to Jim Crow and Reconstruction to civil rights to where we are now. There have been a series of systems that have been created to keep us where we are, because you can't break systems unless you get in them and force change. But you got to understand them first. And so one of the first things that has come to mind because of this current situation that we found ourselves in is we now have opportunities to educate audiences that we may not have had before. And that's because of two reasons. One was because of this crisis of civil unrest. The second is now because of the pandemic, we don't have any in-house programs. All of our programs are virtual. So a lot of our funding has been to conduct these virtual programs. Well, here's the thing. Many of our colleagues from around the country are like, well, I don't have anybody in my museum, but I hosted a virtual program last night where somebody from Tokyo was on, right? So our reach has really just expanded because now virtually, if you got the right marketing and educational tools and get your word out, whether it's social media or whatever platform, right? You got people tuning in. So we created a book club, and we've hosted 5 book clubs around an array of subjects, primarily all African Americans, except for the next to last one was about Nelson Mandela, which I'll talk about a little bit more, because partnerships are really, really important in reaching some of these audiences that we normally don't reach. Partnerships are quintessential, not only reaching audiences, but also getting funding, because funders now realize the strength of collaborations. But the other thing was, we've had these book clubs. 65 to 70% of the participants in all 5 book clubs were white. And the age skewed over 50. And when we asked them why, it was like because of the current situation. Or some of them would say, well, I actually knew Dr. Cameron, or I met him, or I visited the museum. And the one thing that's also helping that kind of diminished any nervousness about this is that almost to the person, whether it's Black, white, Latino, Asian, or in our community, it's a very large Hmong community. Everybody to the person who said, oh, so you're that, yeah, I'm that guy. They want to see the museum come back. They realize the strength of Dr. Cameron, everybody just loved Dr. Cameron. I mean, you could be stopping in from down in Mississippi and you're going to, let's say, Michigan, and you knock on the door, the museum is closed, but Dr. Cameron is in there because he's in there every day. He'll open the door. He won't ask you for any admission. He'll walk you through the museum. And then he'll sit down and talk to you for 3 hours if you've got time to listen, right? People remember that, and people want that again. And people want this museum to be open and successful. So all those things are kind of in the mixture of this balance that you asked about. So some people really want to understand what our work is. Some people just want to say that they've supported our work. Some people want to support our work, and they really need their companies to really understand what their roles could be and what our role has been in the community. So as you can imagine, like during Black History Month, we actually have to turn people away because it's like, first of all, it's only 28 days and we're like doing this and we're doing that. And by the way, we're not even open. But here's the other thing that helps to kind of balance this, where people are exposed. So the Milwaukee Public Museum was able to secure the International Nelson Mandela exhibit, the only one sanctioned by the Mandela family and the ANC. It went to Germany, London, and Milwaukee was the first US city to host it. Unfortunately, we had to host it during the pandemic, which meant that, we had to be really, really limited in its exposure. But what that has done for both of us is, if I may, it's given the museum street cred because they got these Black partners. And the CEO, Dr. Ellen Sinsky, I love her to death because she was very unapologetic and very, very humble. She said, Dr. Bert, when we got this music, when we got the go ahead for this, before we even made arrangements to get it shipped and what it's going to look like, we realized that we were primarily a white institution. Now, by job positions, even though they've always wanted to be open, of course, to everybody in Milwaukee and greater Milwaukee, because their building is like 500,000 square feet. I mean, it's massive. It's been around since the late 1800s as well. But she said, we're a bunch of white folks and we really don't know who and how and what, but you guys do. And so we were very open with funders about that. And it really has helped their image because they are going to move to a separate location, a new location by 2024. And it's closer to the African-American community than it is right now. Right now, it's closer to downtown. It's helped me and it's helped us because it's put us in front of some donors and a broader community that didn't necessarily understand ABHM, had heard about it, but didn't really understand it. And they got a chance to see us work together in tandem. So what we did for them was we were like, look, we don't have a Department of Education, but we can help you penetrate the community. And so we helped them do was create a over 55-person advisory committee that helped them to navigate not the content of the education programs, but how and where they should be administered, who they need to be in front of, the YMCA, YWCA, the Boys and Girls Club, Big Brothers, the whole plethora of them, right? And then the council was extremely diverse. It was made up of everybody. And so they got a chance to feed into the museum in a way in which most of these museums never have not given them opportunities other than, some of the more progressive museums, if they've got a major exhibit coming, they do a focus group. But here's the thing that we just did 2 weeks ago that they really appreciated, and that is what most people have complained about focus groups is that they never see the results of all the research that they did and they captured during these focus groups before the exhibit came or before they constructed it or whatever. What we did was we shared all the results and then said, and this afternoon, we're going to have our first of several follow-up meetings saying, okay, how can we continue this partnership? And we want the council to be in on it. So this is going to eventually end up being an MOU between the Public Museum and the Black Holocaust Museum. And so these partnerships have helped us with funding, and they've helped us kind of cross-pollinate the community in a way in which it hadn't happened before. So it's created this awareness. And then finally, of course, because it was Nelson Mandela, who, regardless of how old you are, what color you are, what ethnicity, everybody admires and adores and loves Nelson Mandela, because how could you not? So those three factors really made it a successful journey. And it helped us once again with this, what you eloquently explained as what's going to be your balance. Finally, on that is because of the pandemic, nobody knows what the new norm is going to be. And so I can't, in all honesty, say what the balance is. What we're going to try to predict what the balance is going to be, but nobody knows, because we also know, and at some point, this flourishing pool is going to turn into a well, and then the well is going to dry up again. And then what do we do? And so I know you've been in on those discussions where between AAAM and AAM, we've done all these surveys of people thinking that they can survive pandemic, and what percentage of museums think that they can open and stay open, or what percentage of museums think they can open and probably won't ever be able to reopen. And those numbers have shifted a little bit because people have kind of amended their practices for now, realizing that they're not going to have any real earned revenue, but so all of their money is going to have to come from raised revenue. But we really just don't know. And we do know, you and I know, that if 30% of all museums don't think that they can successfully reopen, the number for Black museums is probably closer to 40, or even worse. So all those things have to be taken into consideration. So that's my long-winded best answer to balance.
Great answer. And you, in your responses, you've answered so many of the questions I already have, but I want to take this kind of moment as an opportunity to segue into AAAM and the Association of African-American Museums, which I think has an important, it seems to me, potential role to play in all of this, especially in terms of partnerships and how we emerge from COVID. Just wondering if you could talk about your experience with AAAM, what brought you into the organization, and your relationship to the organization today.
So my exposure to AAAM was originally based on my exposure through AAM. So as I said before, I was on AAM's board. And I had heard of AAAM only because I grew up in Chicago, and one of the founders of AAAM was Dr. Margaret Burroughs, who was actually a personal friend of my parents when they lived in Chicago in the 60s and 70s. And she was the founder of the DuSable Museum, which was almost in walking distance from where my wife and I most recently moved from in Chicago. So I was aware of her, aware of AAAM, but not really plugged in because I was also with AZA and really, really involved in AZA. And so I even had board members saying, you already got AZA, what's with this AAM? And their memberships are kind of higher than AZA. I mean, so right, I had to justify, no, this all makes sense and here are the benefits. But during one of our board retreats, Chris Taylor gave a presentation. And it was an update on AAAM. And afterwards, he and I started talking. And he said, your name came up in conversation through Antonesia Stavelov. I said, oh yeah, that's my girl. I mean, we basically saved DivCom of AAM. Me, Antonesia, and Dr. Tanya Matthews. He said, yeah, well, that's what she told me. I said, okay, well, your presentation was great. I was like, are you going to stick around? And he said, yeah. And it was he and this other guy who always, I almost want to say his last name is Black, always wears bow ties, bald. Am I saying this? Sam Black. And I met Sam Black, and Sam was like, oh, you're the zoo guy everybody was talking about. So I was like, yeah, I'm the zoo guy. And we just started talking, and he said to me, you should really, you should really think about, serving AAAM in some kind of way. And I looked at him and I said, well, dude, my plate is really full, but keep me in mind. So now years passed, maybe even 2. I see Chris again, and he says, I haven't forgotten. And he says, Antonija and I want you to consider AAAM. And that was the year. So I've only been on AAAM since the year Vedette was brought on board. So I wasn't on the board when you guys brought Vedette on, but I was made aware because I had actually recommended Omar Eden Martinez to apply for that position. And maybe he did. I can't remember if he did or not. But he called me and he said, look, Bert, they just hired Vedette and she's great. And so all those things kind of happened simultaneously. Chris got back to me. Antonija got back to me. Omar was in my ear. And so it just happened. So I was invited, I guess formally invited to that first board meeting, of which Vedette had just been hired or had been on for maybe a few months. I can't remember. And so that's how I got started. Why I'm really adamant about the work that AAAM is doing is 2 things. One is the mission of AAAM, and I'm segueing back to AAM. One of the things that I said to Chris was, if I'm going to join AAAM, you need to get me on now while I'm still on AAM's board. So if I could serve as a conduit between AAM and AAAM, it would be best served while I'm on both boards. If you wait until I'm off of AAM's board, I'm not saying that we can still do something, but it would be more effective. I could literally pick up the phone and call Laura and say, hey, Vedette is doing this, or call Arthur, who's their fundraising, or the executive VP now, or Brooke, who's the chief of staff, and say, look, I need you to take this call or take this email, respond. And that was the other part. But understanding the importance of the mission of AAAM is really, really important now because of the time that we're in. I mean, when I think about when they started to where we are now, I think Black museums are some of the most important museums of all cultural institutions in the world. Like, I don't want to say this is our time, but I will say, to quote Jesse Jackson, now is the time. And of course, he got that from Dr. King. So I really believe that the strength of AAAM, this is the time for us to maximize it. But that is the person to do it. She's been doing, I mean, I'm the development chair, but she's really just running it by me as she's thinking about it. I'm like, go for it. And so I think Black museums need AAAM more now than we've ever needed them before. And the importance of Black museums is more important now than ever before. So that's why I'm really excited about it, because if I can help in any way, because of the one thing that I realize is that I have been blessed with a unique set of experiences. I won't say talent, experiences where I've worked with elephants and dogs and cats to research to all kinds of different museums. I was the chair of diversity for all zoos and aquariums. I was the chair of diversity for all museums, DivCom. So I've got all these experiences that I want to share with any organizations that can benefit from them, because not many people have kind of cross-fertilized through all these positions like I am. And so what I really want to do is serve. I think that's the best thing I could do, is just serve.
And what then is your vision for the future of AAAM as an organization and the Black Museum field?
I think first and foremost, we have to serve as a resource. And a resource, we used to say clearinghouse for all these things, but I don't think clearinghouse is appropriate anymore. I think we really need to ultimately serve the industry as this resource that provides resources to dollars, resources for sustainability, resources for models of how we need to structure our boards, how we need to structure our operations. I mean, there was a very large percentage of people who we interviewed that didn't have the basic financial structure. They didn't have a finance committee of their board. They didn't have an audit segment of the finance committee of their board. They didn't have any cash reserves. So like, we need to make sure that we set these standards. Now, we can't hold people to it, right? So accreditation is, well, if you're going to be accredited, you need to have these standards met. We could do that as far as that goes, which I think we need to continue to strengthen and do, because a lot of these organizations could really use our help as it relates to, these are the things that are expected of you. And if you don't have them, here's where you can get them, or here's how you can get them. And so I was surprised when I understood that many of these organizations that weren't going to be able to reopen after the pandemic was because they didn't have any cash reserves beyond a year. Some of them didn't have cash reserve beyond 9 months, right? And so somebody on the board should be paying attention to that, right? It's the CEO and the CFO and the development person's job, but board members, they have responsibilities, fiduciary responsibility, their time, their talent, their treasure, and the people that they connect you to, their touch. If they aren't doing those things, if they're not saying to the staff, holding them accountable, you need to have these kind of cash reserves, rainy day fund, whatever the hell you want to call it. You're not going to be successful when there's a crisis, and that's just what happened. And so I really envision AAAM being that go-to umbrella organization that says, these are all the things, this is what success looks like vaguely, right? We can't draw down on those things, but we can set up some pretty simple aspirational goals as to, if you want to be a successful museum and your budget is between 100,000 and 500,000, you need to have these things in place. If it's $1 million to $2 million, I think that's where we best serve the group, but also in working with Robert Bull, who I think we all have a tremendous amount of respect for. I think that AAM can also help in the development and creation of leaders, especially women leaders in our field. So we could create these kind of training sessions with people like Robert Bull and others who actually help the mid-level managers prepare to be senior level managers, and maybe eventually CEOs or COOs. I think that can be some of the responsibility of AAAM too. And people, and then finally, we need to be able to look people in the eye and say, this is why you should be a member. So creating that membership value proposition is really important. Because if people don't feel that there's a value to them being a member, that they can have these resources or get access to training or access to leadership training, funding, strategy, they're going to be like, why am I going to spend my money? Why am I going to travel to Miami or wherever? So we've got to also do our very best job of creating that value proposition for why people want to be members, and then have all these things at the ready and at our disposal to help them become better museums and better leaders within the museum.
As we're coming to the end of this conversation, I do have students who are going to be listening to these, and I'm wondering what comments, recommendations that you would have for students who are listening to this and who are potentially preparing to enter into this world of work.
Well, when I advise people to, whatever you're going to do, right, is to study the craft. So make sure that you study the craft, you aspire to learn as much as you can through studying or by connecting with someone who's doing what you want to do. So if you want to be, so for example, on Facebook today, I get a message from one of my dear friends who's a professor in Nebraska who has a friend who's in Kansas City whose 5-year-old daughter has already said, I love animals and I'm going to be a zookeeper. So he rattles off this long text to me. And I was like, dude, number one, I'm so glad that your 5-year-old has already claimed her destiny, right? But he's like, well, who can she shadow? And I was like, dude, we're still in COVID. She's not coming behind the scenes, number one. Number two, she's too young. Nobody's going to take her behind the scenes at the age of 5. Now, there are other educational opportunities, but for your students is to volunteer where you can, whatever museum, whatever industry you want, you got to learn as much about it as you can. Because if you go in there cold, even though you're going in there eyes wide open, there are a lot of things about it that you could have already conquered if you volunteer with people, you volunteer with the organization. And here's the other thing about volunteering, which is really, really important. If you volunteered for my organization and you created a reputation of being hardworking, sincere, team player, all the above, and you then apply for a position that comes open, you're more likely to, at the very least, get an interview than somebody that's walking right off the street that I don't know. And if you get recommendations from people that you work with that said, yeah, you know what, Mr. Luckett over there, he did such and such and such and such, and here's my recommendation. Why would we recreate the wheel if we've already invested into someone and they want to join the team? So learn the craft, find people who are doing what you want to do, reach out to them. And virtually now, if you reach out to someone and say, I'm an aspiring museum professional and you do this, I know you're really busy, but if you ever have time to do a Zoom call, 30-minute Zoom call, this is our lives now. They're more likely to say, okay, yeah, schedule it through my assistant. And now you've got to be prepared because you got 29 and a half minutes to say what you want to say to impress this person to the point where they say, hey, here's the next step. And then finally, volunteer so that you can learn as much about the organization, learn as much about the museum, and then get an inside track. And finally, if you're students, I always say this to my students, because I've taught at university level too. Work hard, play hard. If you study your butts off, you get to have some fun, but only if you study your butts off, right? So be a well-rounded individual, but you get to play some, you get to have fun, that's legal, if you deserve it because you've given it 100%.
That's great advice. Any final comments before we end our conversation here?
My parting is to you. Thank you for doing this. This is when you capture these people's stories. Number one, just doing this is going to help students to say, hey, I can call Bert, I can call Vedette, I can call Anisha, I can call Omar, I can call Tom. So you've already created this network that people will feel they can connect to. So number one, first and foremost, thank you for that. But also, this being the gift that keeps on giving, this is a living part of the archives of AAAM now. And you've got all these varying people talking about mission and their individual visions that hopefully can become a collective of the entire vision of AAAM. So this is almost like you're doing some work for Robert Bull without him having to do anything, because you've now got this kind of reservoir of information that are dealing with people's careers, people's aspirations, but also people's thoughts about the future of AAAM. So thanks for doing this for your students. I hope they appreciate it, but also for AAAM, because I know I appreciate it, because I barely have had time to look at all of these interviews, but over time, these things, like they say, once you put something out there on the internets, they never disappear. And so this is part of the living history of AAAM. So my hat's off to you. And thank you for doing this.
Well, it's been my great pleasure to get to do these. It's been a remarkable project and semester of conversations. Dr. Bert Davis, thank you very much for joining me today. I'm deeply grateful.
So am I. Thanks. Enjoy the rest of your day.